and hand things over to David. So David, the virtual floor is yours. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for the introduction. So there's a handout in the chat, and I encourage you definitely to look at the handout on your own. But if you'd like to follow along on my screen instead, I'll just project the handout as I see it. Let's make it full screen. All right, so Herbert Simon held that the fundamental turn in the study of bounded rationality is the procedural turn, from what he called substantive to procedural rationality. So he didn't always put the turn quite like this. I actually had to skip a couple of years to get the quote I wanted. But I think the right way to put the turn is this. We have to give account not only of substantive rationality, the extent to which appropriate courses of action are chosen during deliberation, but also procedural rationality, the effectiveness in light of human cognitive powers and limitations of the procedures used to choose action. So what's the turn? You stop studying the actions that result from processes of inquiry, and you start studying the processes themselves. But of course, philosophers don't think actions result from inquiry. We think inquiry produces intentions, which produce actions. So for philosophers, it's going to be a turn away from attitudes like intention, like belief, like preference, and towards the processes of inquiry that produce those attitudes. So after Simon said this, and actually to some extent before Simon said this, this came to structure a lot of research in bounded rationality. Most bounded rationality scholars, at least outside of philosophy, made the procedural turn. So I'll tell you a little bit later in this talk about why bounded rationality scholars have thought that we need to make the turn. But today I want to talk about a surprising, or hopefully by the end of the talk, not so surprising parallel in the epistemology of inquiry. So here Jane Friedman has urged quite famously that we need to take a zetetic turn away from belief, or more generally away from doxastic attitudes, and towards the processes of theoretical inquiry that produce them. So here's the first passage telling us what we're moving away from. On the doxastic paradigm, epistemic norms bear almost exclusively on having, forming, revising, maintaining, and so on beliefs and other belief-like attitudes, right? Epistemology is about attitudes. What are we going towards? Taking the zetetic turn means moving to thinking of the norms of epistemology as speaking to the entire process of inquiry. So here, I don't think there's any interpretive work needed. The zetetic turn is thinking less about belief and doxastic attitudes and more about the processes of theoretical inquiry that produce them. Okay, so I hope the parallel here is clear. The procedural turn says spend less time studying attitudes when you're doing bounded rationality and study more the processes of inquiry that produce those attitudes. And the zetetic turn is one half of that turn, namely spend less time studying theoretical attitudes and spend more time studying theoretical inquiry. So the driving thesis of this talk is simply that this is not a coincidence. This is actually a deep and important normative fact. Namely that we should treat the zetetic turn from belief to theoretical inquiry as just one half of a broader procedural turn in bounded rationality from attitudes to inquiry. And then I want to turn around and use this interpretation to do three things. So first, actually, before arguing for my main thesis, I need to take this interpretation in hand and use it to clarify the zetetic turn. So we're going to see in the theory of procedural rationality and also hence in zetetic rationality, there are two very different ways we can interpret the zetetic turn. And a lot of normative facts turn on this interpretation. We're going to have to knock it out first just because there's really no way to do the rest until we've got the right interpretation in view. Off stage, of course, the main project. I think I'm going to say a little bit about this in the written up version of this paper, but nothing today. The main project is just to draw lessons for zetetic epistemology. So if it's true that this turn we're making in epistemology just is an instance of a broader turn in theorizing about bounded rationality, then it's probably a good idea, normatively speaking, to take some theses we think that we know to be true about bounded rationality and try them out in epistemology as claims about rational inquiry. So I'm happy to talk your ear off about that project, but this paper is mostly setting up the ground for that project rather than carrying it out. And then, of course, I want to motivate a second zetetic turn in practical philosophy, right? So the procedural turn is from attitudes to inquiry. not just from doxastic attitudes to inquiry. Your practical attitudes, your intentions, your plans, your preferences also come from, we usually call them decision procedures, but you can call them processes of practical inquiry if you'd like. So the idea is that insofar as this is a broader turn in bounded rationality, we got to do it not only in the doxastic case, but also in the practical case. All right, so that's the project. First, before I argue for the main claim, I need to talk you through two different ways you can interpret the procedural turn. So the vocabulary coming here is just coming in from ethics, think like 1980s style consequentialism. On the one hand, you can take a direct interpretation of the procedural turn. And here you're going to say substantive rationality asks questions about the rationality of one thing, namely attitudes, intention, preference, belief, desire, credence. Procedural rationality just goes a level up and asks questions about the rationality of processes of practical or theoretical rationality, of inquiry, which produce those attitudes. And here the relationship between substantive and procedural rationality is going to be purely complementary, right? Substantive rationality asks about attitudes, procedural rationality asks about inquiry. There's no competition here. And so on this interpretation, and if you can't tell yet, I like this interpretation. What it means to take a procedural turn is not to deny facts about the rationality of attitude. It's simply to take a process-focused stance in normative theorizing, to say that normative theories, at least insofar as we care about bounded rationality, need to be more focused on articulating facts about rational inquiry than about the rationality of attitudes. Now, that's what Simon said in 1978. That's what I hope you're going to believe. There's another interpretation of the procedural turn that's going to be a little bit more revisionary. This is an indirect interpretation, and you see, I think, pretty clear echoes of this in Jane Friedman, although I can't pin it on her. You see a lot of this in Abelard Pogorsky's work on process rationality, on rational delay. And you certainly see it right from the beginning in Herbert Simon, and more generally, it's just kind of the mainstream interpretation in bounded rationality of the procedural turn. So indirect normative theory does here what it always does. It's going to say substantive rationality asks normative questions about the rationality of attitudes, just ignoring the processes that produce them and thinking about the rationality of attitudes on their own lights. So in epistemology, pretty much anything but reliabilism will do here. Evidentialism, a belief's rational when it's evidentially supported. Veritism when it's true, your favorite expected accuracy norm. Reliabilism goes indirect, so just don't think of that here. And then procedural rationality is going to be cast not as a theory of rational processes, but as a theory of rational attitudes. Going procedural here means you evaluate the rationality of attitudes, not on their own merit, so they evidentially supported, say, but based on the merits of the process that produced them. And almost always this just means an attitude's rational when it was produced by a rational process. So this is the passage that introduced, or half of the passage that introduced procedural rationality. And Herbert Simon just went whole hog indirect here. He said behavior is procedurally rational when it's the outcome of appropriate deliberation. And most of the bounded tradition has expanded that so that also preferences or beliefs or credences are rational when they result from, probably shouldn't have said appropriate, should have said rational deliberation. Of course, here the relationship between substantive and procedural rationality comes to a head because now these theories have the same object, attitudes, and they're competing theories. Substantive rationality is traditional epistemology, and procedural rationality is coming in and revising that. So taking the procedural turn means rejecting traditional epistemic theories in favor of competing procedural theories. So when you see Jane Friedman say we need to throw away most of traditional epistemic norms, I think that's what's going on here. When you see Gerd Gigerens are saying coherent beliefs can be rational, I think that's what's going on here. And the goal of this section is maybe to articulate a way to not go that far. So I guess that's foreshadowing a little bit why the distinction between direct and indirect interpretations matters. And of course, the distinction matters across normative theory because in a lot of different areas, we get at least apparent tension between the rational status of an attitude and the rational status of the deliberation process that produced it. So most famously, we get this in 1980s consequentialism, right? There was this objection, consequentialism is self-defeating because you say you should take the expectedly best action or hold the expectedly best intention. But you also admit, of course, it would be irrational to explicitly calculate expected utilities, which just means that rational deliberation about what to intend is not always going to lead you to the rational intention. So we had to figure out what's going on there. We've, I think, rediscovered this debate in the epistemology of inquiry. Jane Friedman said quite correctly, it's just not true. Take your favorite epistemic norm like evidentialism. It's just not true that rational inquiry always produces evidentially supported beliefs, or that evidentially supported beliefs could always be produced by some process of rational inquiry. So you have the same kind of attention here. These have been talked about, so I want to talk about today something to do with bounded rationalities, just to show you the same kinds of cases in the traditional bounded rationality literature. And of course, in these cases, when you have tension between the rational status of an attitude and an inquiry, the indirect theorist has to go revisionary, right? Because she says the rational status of an inquiry and an attitude have to match. So she's going to have pressure to revise traditional attitudinal norms to match the newfangled bounded rationality norms on inquiry. And this is where you get the really heavy revisionary consequences from people like, like Gigerenzer and Friedman. Right, so where do we get at least the appearance of tension between the rationality of attitudes and the rationality of inquiries? Pretty much as soon as you put a bounded rationality norm on inquiry, that's where most of our norms live. And pretty much as soon as you put a traditional norm on attitudes, you're going to get some kind of tension. So let's just start from one theme from research on bounded rationality. And definitely the order's gone out that you are not allowed to say this is all bounded rationality is, but certainly an important theme in the study of bounded rationality is that rational inquirers have to be resource rational. They have to make rational use of scarce resources during inquiry. I shouldn't actually have said scarce cognitive resources. So you've got to ration cognitive resources like compute power, like attention, like memory. You've also got to ration non-cognitive resources. Inquiry takes time. Inquiry takes money. Travel during inquiry consumes carbon. And you've got to balance these costs so that scarce resources can be allocated between different inquiries and also between inquiry and other activities. So what does resource rationality come to? Let's just cheat and leave the strength of this reason unspecified. So at a bare minimum, resource rationality says, if I, as a process of reasoning, say, for inquiry, say like a reasoning heuristic, and I consume some valuable resource R, like compute power or time, then the fact that your inquiry consumes R is a reason against engaging in the inquiry I. Never mind the strength of it. Resource rationality says consuming scarce resources, if they're worth something, is a reason against inquiry. Why? Because they're valuable resources. All right, so that's a norm on processes. To get some tension, just take your favorite attitudinal norm. Again, anything that's not indirect, so like not reliabilism will work here. I'm just going to go with evidentialism. Says traditionally, for any agent S and any proposition P, if S believes that P, then that belief's rational, just in case two things hold. So of course, the total evidence in fact supports P, and the agent's belief is appropriately based on the evidence. So these norms will get us tension, resource rationality on inquiry and evidentialism on belief. To get in one direction, maybe tension between the rationality of inquiry and the rationality of belief. You want an irrational inquiry leading to rational belief. So what's the recipe here? Just waste a bunch of resources during inquiry. That's going to make your inquiry rational, but it's not going to tend to make your belief irrational, right? It's going to, if anything, improve the rationality of your belief by getting you lots of evidence, and that's how you get a conflict in this direction. I guess spelling it out is the case I'm calling long video. So you might imagine Gertrude's in charge of security for a large retail store. And Gertrude wants to know whether Bonnie and Clyde have been stealing from the store. And let's assume Gertrude has 17 hours of video footage showing Bonnie visiting the store. But after just reviewing an hour of footage, Gertrude's got extremely convincing evidence Bonnie's been shoplifting. She's got Bonnie on film, taking things and putting them in her purse and leaving the store. But instead of closing inquiry here, you might imagine Gertrude keeps watching all 17 hours of footage before concluding that Bonnie's been stealing. So on the one hand, anything but the very weakest principle of resource rationality is going to say Gertrude's inquiry here is irrational. Why is it irrational? Well, after an hour, she already had, in actuality and expectation, just about all the cognitive gains she's going to get. She had knowledge, she had very high credence, she had, very robust belief, evidentially supported belief. But she spent another 16 hours of her life on this inquiry for very little expected gain, either in the epistemic domain or just in her practical life. It's going to look like that's not going to outweigh the resource expenditure. But at least in appearance, if you like evidentialism, Gertrude's going to form a rational belief here. So it's, I think, not too hard to suppose that after 17 hours of watching the video, Gertrude's got abundant evidence that Bonnie's been stealing and correctly forms the belief based on the evidence of Bonnie's stealing. And then most traditional epistemic theories are going to say that's a perfectly rational belief. So that's how you get tension in the one direction. To get apparently rational inquiry in the other direction, rational inquiry leading to irrational belief. Just think about your favorite case of heuristic reasoning. Maybe the Heuristics and Biases program will do this if you know this literature. Here, what I've done is I've just taken a famous heuristic, take the best, and I've taken the motivating case for this heuristic. I've souped the heuristic up a little bit to make it more expensive because I find that sometimes philosophers get scared by very frugal heuristics. But actually, I think the heuristic in this example is probably too expensive if you like heuristics. Anyways, imagine that Shoshana is just very mildly curious whether the German city Mainz is more populous than the German city Lübeck. And so she calls up what she knows about both of the cities. And let's say she calls up, one at a time, maybe 24 facts. Sorry, I forgot to change the gender when I was copy pasting a new name that she knows about Mainz and Lübeck. So for example, she says, well, Mainz is a state capital and Lübeck isn't, and state capitals tend to be larger than non-capitals. And maybe she also considers the presence of a train line or having hosted a major international convention. And after a couple dozen items of information, Shoshana's got absolutely no reason we might suppose to consider she's looked at a biased sample of information or an unrepresentative sample or an underpowered sample. So she closes inquiry with a judgment that Mainz is more populous than Lübeck. But unfortunately, Lübeck is more populous than Mainz, and we might construct the scenario so that Shoshana's total evidence favors this conclusion. Actually, if you look at the original Take the Best paper and you just, imagine she's looking at one item of evidence instead of 24, I think that's a pretty plausible conclusion in this example in that paper. So at least in appearance, we have a rational inquiry here, right? So Shoshana is using a souped up version of one of everybody's favorite heuristics in a domain where it looks quite frugal and reliable and warranted. If anything, the complaint is, resource rationality. We've souped it up too much. But at least we have the appearance of an irrational belief, right? Because Shoshana's belief is not supported by the totality of her evidence. She just unluckily rationally failed to consider all of her evidence. Who does that? But unluckily, it turned out the evidence she didn't consider mattered. And there's just no getting around that for an evidentialist. So when you get these apparent cases of conflict between the rationality of belief and the rationality of the inquiries that produced it, you can react in three ways. On the one hand, you can do, maybe some unbounded theorists would do this. I'm not sure. You could just deny all the procedural norms, which is, usually going to mean knocking out all the bounded rationality norms. But the problem here is you're going to end up denying most of bounded rationality, right? So, if you're going to tell me that it's false that the resources consumed during inquiry matter, I'm going to suspect that you really don't want to do bounded rationality anymore. Another reaction, and I think this is the way that indirect theorists are going, is to deny the norms on attitudes, right? So you have the idea, okay, rational inquiry can somehow times produce irrational beliefs. So, the at least appearance of irrationality beliefs must be wrong. It must be that the beliefs that result from rational inquiry are in fact rational. And this is where you get, Jane Friedman saying we need to revise traditional norms and attitudes because rational inquiry can produce attitudes that violate them. This is where we get Gerd Gigerens are saying we need to dump coherence norms. I can talk a little bit about how much you're going to lose here. I think you're not only going to lose traditional epistemology, I think you're going to lose just about any norm on attitudes that most philosophers know and love going this way. So the reaction I want to suggest here, and I'm happy to argue more for this, is simply to go direct, to say, look, it's one thing to ask about the rationality of attitudes, an entirely different thing to ask about the rationality of inquiries. We never said there was going to be a tight relationship in theory between the rationality of attitudes and the rationality of inquiries. So when you get these coming apart in cases, that's just not surprising or a cause for any of these revisionary normative reactions. So we can talk more about that. I'm going to assume a direct interpretation going forward. And I had to do that first in this paper just because obviously the dialectic in the rest of the paper is going to change if you don't have a direct interpretation on board. So the main writer of the paper and the thing I want to spend the most time talking about is a bidirectional claim. On the one hand, we have a very strong claim about inquiry, namely we should treat not only the Zetetic turn and inquiry, but I'm going to claim the entire subject of rational inquiry as just a bounded rationality program. And in the other direction, we have a little weaker claim that bounded rationality is not only about inquiry, but should be process focused, right? That bounded rationality needs to be focused more strongly on articulated norms governing inquiry than on norms governing attitudes. So the arguments in this section, I think especially the second, are pretty classic arguments. They haven't been written up to my satisfaction anywhere, which is why I'm writing them up. But I don't want to claim, especially in like 3.2, that I'm doing anything original here. So I apologize for not citing. I just honestly didn't know who to cite, probably just Herbert Simon a lot. So on the one hand, why would you think that the study of inquiry as we conceive it just is a bounded rationality program, and that the Zetetic turn in inquiry should be thought of as, a part of a broader procedural turn? And here the answer is that if you think about many of the most important challenges or questions that arise in rational inquiry, these challenges essentially arise because we're bounded agents. And if you take away the bounds, the claim is that our most familiar challenges in inquiry would either just fail to arise as normative questions, or else these challenges and their answers would be so far unrecognizable that I think that's just not what we're doing when we study rational inquiry. So just by way of example, let's think about some challenges that inquirers face, some of the challenges that have motivated normative debates in recent epistemology, and let's try to think about the bounds on agents that make these challenges into genuine and interesting challenges. So gathering evidence, when, why, and how should a bounded agent gather evidence? Again, this question only arises because we're informationally bounded. There's some information or evidence we have, but there's also some information or evidence that we lack, and we can have duties to gather evidence because there's some information we don't have and need to get. A lot of philosophers of mind think like Susanna Siegel, work about inquiry and attention. They say, how should I allocate attention during inquiry? There are just many things going on and I can't attend to all of them. So which should I pay attention to? And this question arises because we're attentionally bounded. We can't pay attention to everything in our visual field or our internal experience at once. Double checking's been big. So I guess Jane Freeman's written on this. Elise Woodard's got some work that's relevant to this. I think she's here. And of course, the question about rational double checking, when, why, and how, is it rational to? Sorry, also Ariana's written about this, I think is here. When, why, and how is it rational to double check? Comes up because we're fallible agents. If there weren't a possibility we'd made mistakes in the first place, the answer would be, why would you double check? That doesn't make any sense. Also, metacognitive selection of reasoning strategies. We don't always talk about this in philosophy, but this is in many ways just the big question for social scientific theories about irrationality. Questions like when to think fast and when to think slow, or if you're going to think fast, which heuristic should you use and how should you parameterize it? And these questions, they don't arise only because we're computationally bounded agents. I think Gerd Gigerenzer would have something very strong to say about that claim. But they do arise in large part because we're computationally bounded agents. We can't always just grab the most expensive strategies and run it. And that's why questions about strategy selection become so interesting, is because we have to do some rationing and some picking and choosing. Likewise, junk beliefs. So Gil Harman, I guess, introduced this idea that rational inquirers need to avoid junk or trivial beliefs, and Jane Freeman and others have picked this up. And this is a question many people thought because we have bounds on memory. Certainly that's what Gil Harman said. So Gil Harman thought the problem is you're going to run out of storage space in memory. If you form too many junk beliefs, you'll just run out of space. Turns out that's controversial depending on your views of memory, whether that's a big risk. But certainly on the other end, you have retrieval worries, right? If you put a bunch of junk in your memory and then you try to call up useful information about cities or about philosophy, you'll just start pulling up useless information about crickets, and it'll be very hard to make judgments and decisions. And so it's because we have storage and retrieval limits in memory that junk's a problem. Otherwise, there would just be no problem with junk. And again, we can look back at these questions and say, what would happen to these questions we ask about rational inquiry if we took away the bounds that generate them? And the answer is either that they wouldn't be questions, or in some cases, they'd be very, very strange and unrecognizable questions. So rational evidence gathering: when, why, and how should an informationally unbounded agent gather evidence? Well, never. They already have the evidence. Why would they gather it? Allocating attention: when, why, and how should an agent allocate their attention if they're not attentionally bounded? Well, what do you mean? They should attend to everything. There's no problem here. Double checking: suppose you're not fallible. When, why, and how should you double check? You should never double check. You know you didn't make a mistake the first time. Selecting reasoning strategies: suppose you weren't computationally limited. You might think the right thing to do is just run the most expensive strategy all the time, but it turns out it's even worse than that, right? What you want to do is you would want to instantly and in parallel execute every single relevant strategy you can think of, and then apply your favorite judgment aggregation rule. And I'd like to submit that's just not how most of us think about metacognitive strategy selection as a rational question. And likewise, junk belief: suppose, there's infinite room in memory and there's no problem with pulling up clutter in later memory retrieval. Then you ask, what's wrong with forming junk beliefs? And I think plausibly people will say, well, nothing's wrong with junk beliefs. If you've got no limits on memory, why would there be a problem here? So the moral here is that the study of inquiry as we know it, that studies challenges like the challenges in the left-hand side of the table and delivers answers like the kinds of answers that we commonly deliver, just has to be thought of as a part of a study of bounded rationality, because we don't get the subject back as we know and love it if we take the bounds out. All right, so in the other direction, I want to make a couple of classic arguments, but I want to make them in, I think, a little bit more length, because I couldn't find anybody who wrote these up in a way that I liked. So if anybody knows where these are written up really well, let me know, and maybe I won't write these up. But I think they could be worth talking through in detail. So of course, Herbert Simon said the fundamental turn of the study of bounded rationality is the turn from substantive procedural rationality, i.e. study a lot of inquiry. And the question is, why on earth did he think that we had to do that? So let's just start with an easier question. Why do you think that bounded rationality theorists should care at least a little bit about inquiry? And here, I think one of the most classic arguments, no originality here, is that many of our most fundamental and paradigmatic cognitive bounds might sometimes show up as bounds on attitudes, but they more often show up as bounds on processes rather than attitudes. So two examples here. Think about the cost of computation. Computational costs are not costs of attitudes. Holding a belief doesn't cost me anything. Holding a preference doesn't cost me anything. Holding an intention doesn't cost me anything, or at least it doesn't incur a computational cost. Computational costs are fundamentally costs incurred by the processes of inquiry which produce our attitudes. And so when you look at traditional theories of rationality of attitudes, they entirely ignore, from my perspective, as they should, they entirely ignore computational costs. An evidentialist does not say that the computational cost of inquiring in order to get a belief bears on the rationality of that belief. It just says a belief's rational when it's evidentially supported. But then, of course, when you realize that computational costs only show up when you ask a different question, like how's it rational to inquire, you start to see that paradigmatic bounds might be felt a little more strongly on inquiry than attitudes. And you get this also with limited abilities. So certainly there are some limits to our abilities to hold beliefs. If something is especially complex, maybe we can't believe it. And maybe if it's especially demotivational or sad, we can't believe it. But more often the problem is with our reasoning abilities and not our believing abilities. If you think about a complicated mathematical proposition, the problem is that we can't usually, not usually that we could not believe the proposition. It's not that bad. The problem is that we couldn't in our lifetime execute any process of computation that would lead us to realize that this was the correct answer to the question. So here again, the ability bound is going to be felt not exclusively, but I think most strongly as a bound on processes rather than attitudes. All right, so that's why you would think that bounded rationality people have to pay some attention to inquiry, namely that's where a lot of our bounds start getting to be pretty sharp. But of course, my interpretation of the procedural turn, which is I think the weakest on offer, says that bounded rationality needs to be process focused. Spend at least as much time on processes of inquiry rather than attitudes. And you might ask me, why do we make this stronger claim? To some extent, I think I've already given you an argument for the stronger claim, right? A lot of the bounds just show up more strongly on processes rather than attitudes. But I'd like to give you another answer that I think is going to need a little bit of time to develop. And the answer here is that if you look at cases where substantive and procedural facts come apart, right? These were the section 2 cases. And you look at the cases where the reason they come apart is because bounds drive them apart. There are bounds on processes, but they're not felt as strongly as bounds on substantive facts. So the substantive facts just don't mention those bounds on processes. Here, the substantive facts are going to give you really misleading or uncharitable pictures of normative reality. So the point here is that often when bounds are driving these things apart, you get bounded rationality right by thinking about procedural facts and maybe get it at least in a little bit of distortion by thinking about substantive facts. So an example motivating this would be the psychology of poverty. And we really need to get into this example by facing down some very troubling findings. And these are findings that need to be said out loud. They need to be said, I think, with a great deal of softness, with a great deal of effort to avoid victim blaming. But these are findings that we need to face down and figure out how to make them better as normative theorists. So the underlying finding is that material poverty, just, the situation of poverty, predicts and apparently causally predicts substantially decreased performance on any cognitive measure you might care about, on reasoning, on intention, on memory, on ability to control yourself. And not only does poverty predict cognitive impairments, but these impairments perpetuate poverty traps, the kinds of patterns of behavior that, pundits are likely to blame on the poor, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, and the kinds of patterns of behavior that make it so hard to escape cycles of poverty. Things like overborrowing, taking payday loans at 300% interest, or undersaving, often saving absolutely nothing. Things like non-compliance with medical instructions, being given free medicine and not taking it, even though you understand, for example, that the medicine's necessary. And when we see these results, you know what somebody like Rush Limbaugh is going to say, right? They're going to say bullet point 1 shows you the poor are stupid and irrational people. And bullet point 2, it's because the poor are irrational that they get stuck in poverty. It's their own irrationality that leads them to borrow or save or something like that. And this is, I think, the kind of thing that a theory of rationality just must not say. But the question is how, as a normative theorist, to avoid saying something like that while also accepting the empirical findings. And the answer is obviously going to be multidimensional. Even, the move from like poverty to behaviors is going to be multidimensional. But I think some part of the standard salvage story is something like this. So this is Eldar Shafir out of Princeton. Jennifer Morton, I guess, introduced this to philosophers. And so the thought here is that the situation of poverty, material poverty, just creates very large numbers of pressing short-term cognitive challenges. How do you pay your bills, keep the lights on, get enough food, find a babysitter for your kid? Well, you've got a job interview. And then these challenges just go away if you have money, right? The answer to all of these challenges is to use your credit card. But that if you don't, these challenges can be much more pressing and serious and numerous in your cognitive life. And the modal response here has been that the rational response to material poverty is going to be a short-termist reallocation of cognitive resources, things like attention, pay attention to short-term consequences, things like computational bandwidth, spend most of your compute power putting out short-term immediate fires towards the most important short-term cognitive challenges. So here's how a leading study puts the point. They say, well, the human cognitive system has limited capacity. Preoccupations with budgetary concerns leave us fewer cognitive resources to guide choice and action. Just like an air traffic controller, if they're focusing on a collision course, is prone, fairly enough, to neglect other planes in the air. The poor, when attending to monetary concerns, or I could have said babysitting or something like that, lose their capacity to give other problems full consideration. But of course, this isn't irrational. Nobody's suggesting this is irrational. This is a rationality story, how shifting resources preferentially towards short-term cognitive challenges could be warranted in the material situation of poverty, just like in the situation of the air traffic controller. The problem, of course, and this is the Rush Limbaugh problem, is when you ask what a rational short-termist reallocation of cognitive resources is going to do predictably to the attitudes that agents form in certain classes of situations. And the answer is, in some situations that we might care about, it's going to tend to make their attitudes irrational. So one class of cases is just low stakes decisions. If you're reallocating cognitive resources towards important decisions and away from low stakes decisions, and if you're judging at the supermarket, say which can of beans is the best value, you're not going to explicitly calculate price per unit weight or anything like that. So you're often going to form an irrational belief, or if you like, an irrational intention regarding the value of beans or which can of beans to buy. And don't forget the stakes here. Let's get to overborrowing. So there are many reasons people take payday loans. I don't want to suggest that the only reason is irrationality. But one reason that has been pretty well established is rational short-termism causes you to pay less attention to short-term consequences. But things like payday loans and more generally overborrowing have long-term consequences that matter. But if you're thinking mostly from a short-term perspective, you're not going to notice, or you're not going to give sufficient weight to short-term consequences. So you're going to irrationally judge that a payday loan is a good bargain, or that you're likely to pay it back or such, and be more likely to take the loan. So in cases like this, I think we want to say three things. So Rush Limbaugh is right about the substantive facts, right? Evidentially unsupported beliefs about cans of beans or about payday loans are irrational, as are the intentions, to buy the beans or to take the payday loans. There is just no way, I think, to work around that. But we can put it in context when we stress a second procedural fact. Namely, first, these beliefs are the direct result of a rational pattern of cognitive reallocation of resources during inquiry, right? A short-termist pattern of attention and computational bandwidth and the like. And more importantly, these beliefs could only have been avoided by switching to an alternative and less rational process of inquiry. And the process-focused claim is something like this. We can and should say both the substantive and the procedural facts. But because the procedural facts are different from the substantive facts in virtue of seeing bounds like computational cost, like limited attention, the substantive facts just can't see. It's the procedural facts that give you a more charitable and more complete and more illuminating perspective into what's going on into a case like this than the substantive facts do. All right, I want to end on time, so I want to skip through an objection to process focus. Is just going to talk a little bit more about some of the normative implications that process focus can have. And I want to move us down to the last quick section of the paper, which is thinking about two zetetic turns. So what have we done so far? We've seen that the zetetic turn from doxastic attitudes to theoretical inquiry is helpfully regarded as part of a larger procedural turn in the study of bounded rationality from attitudes towards the processes of inquiry that produce them. We've also distinguished between a direct and an indirect interpretation of the procedural turn and suggested taking a direct interpretation. One's about the rationality of attitudes and the other is about the rationality of processes of inquiry. But now remember, the procedural turn's more general than the zetetic turn. So the zetetic turn epistemology says don't study doxastic attitudes like credence and belief. We do enough of that. You can write about these things, they're important, but also spend a lot of time studying inquiry. But remember, our plans and our intentions and our preferences and our practical attitudes are also the results of practical inquiry. And so if it's the underlying procedural turn doing the driving here, that when we're studying bounded rationality, we need to move away from attitudes and towards processes of inquiry, then we have just as much reason, and actually entirely the same reason, to take a second zetetic turn in practical philosophy away from practical attitudes and towards processes of practical inquiry. So here I'm just going to repeat the entire discussion of the paper in practical terms. Practical attitudes, like our theoretical attitudes, are not produced ex nihilo. They're the result of costly and of ability constrained processes in practical inquiry, things like decision-making heuristics. And remember, paradigmatic bounds are just often felt most strongly, like in the doxastic case, as bounds on processes rather than attitudes. So just use the same examples I used before. Deliberation costs are, costs of processes of practical inquiry. They're not costs of intention. And again, computational abilities. The worry is not usually I can't intend to do the expectedly best thing. It's that I can't calculate the expectedly best thing. We get, for exactly the same kinds of reasons, tension between traditional norms and attitudes like intention and plausible bounded rationality norms on processes. So again, this was, what Derek Parfit was working through in the 80s. And it's what happened to ages like Fatima. She intends to buy the wrong can of beans, but she does it as a result of resource rational inquiry. And this tension in the practical case, no less than the theoretical case, is going to help us to understand the importance of a process-focused practical philosophy, right? If we want to understand what's going on with Fatima and the can of beans, or which name did I use? Emilio with the loan, we need to think not only about the irrationality of their intentions, but the fundamental rationality of their processes of inquiry. And I've got to skip bullet point 5 because it's related to the other point that I skipped. Now there's some good news here, because if the program is just to look to bounded rationality for guidance about procedural rationality or the rationality of inquiry, not all, but the majority of bounded rationality theorizing has already been done in the case of practical rather than theoretical philosophy, right? So if you think about Herbert Simon does his dissertation in 1947, he was studying practical philosophy, the economic behavior of managers. And Simon said, managers make decisions using these things called cognitive processes. And I don't see cognitive processes anywhere in neoclassical economic models. And it turns out because managers use processes and aren't in these models, sometimes they don't form the attitudes these models say they'll form. And ever since, there's been a lot of emphasis in the bounded rationality literature on practical inquiry, or for us, heuristic decision-making. So if you look, for example, at the Fast and Frugal heuristics program, which is probably the best modern descendant of Herbert Simon, it's definitely not true that everything these people are doing is to do with decision-making rather than judgment formation. My German cities example was also from them. But certainly I think the majority of work in this program has been on heuristic decision-making. So that's the good news, is we maybe already have a lot to draw on in the practical case. Wrapping up, just some suggested lessons and then a summary. So lesson number 1, we need to take a zetetic turn in practical philosophy, right? If what's motivating the zetetic turn in epistemology is just fundamentally the procedural turn in bounded rationality, that's not a turn within epistemology, that's the turn within bounded rationality, full stop. The second hope, and this is, I guess, a little bit off stage in the presentation I've given, is that existing theories of bounded rationality, especially in the practical case, are a very good place to start. These are people who've thought really deeply in a normative and descriptive way about processes of inquiry. And finally, one thing you might take on board from these people, I probably should argue for this a little bit more, is that zetetic epistemology and zetetic practical philosophy might be more deeply connected than commonly thought. So for example, if you're just taking results from the heuristics and not the heuristics and biases program, please don't, from the Fast and Frugal heuristics program, you're going to see a lot of the same heuristics just being renamed and repurposed as heuristics for judgment and decision making. And more generally, a lot of the major normative theses you're going to see in these programs are going to be advocated across the board. So summing up, what did we do today? We introduced the zetetic turn from doxastic attitudes to theoretical inquiry, argued that this is part of a more fundamental procedural turn and study bounded rationality. distinguished again two interpretations of the procedural turn, plunked for an indirect, for a direct interpretation. I think it is time to wrap up. And then drew some lessons, the chief lesson being the need for a second procedural turn in the study of bounded rationality. Thanks.
I was actually right on time because I think we started 3 minutes late, so that was a perfect 45 minutes. So yeah, nicely done. We'll take a short 5-minute break now. So in my zone of time, that is at 10:53. But yeah, I'll leave the room open and see you all in 5 minutes. And yeah, we'll start the questions.